Hello, friends. Welcome to my channel, Learn with Rushan. So, Today we are going to discuss another important topic under Microsoft Entity Framework Core, okay, which is dynamic database migration and seeding. Okay, so let's look at the topics that we are going to discuss today. So, first of all, we'll take an introduction and then we'll find out what is database migration and seeding is. Uh, so let us proceed. Yeah. Now to start up, right? Uh, Entity framework, as you all know, is a very popular ORM, uh, also known as Object Relational Mapper, used in the industry widely, right? So it is a product of Microsoft. So this object relational mapper, or in other words, ORM, will uh, be based in the middle of the data access layer of our application as well as the physical database. So, in other words, an object relational mapper or an ORM like entity framework will abstract most of the database operations uh, from the data access layer of our application and with the physical database, right? So as you all might have worked with ADO.NET before, in Microsoft.NET, we had to write a lot of code when it comes to executing data retrieval operations as well as data manipulation operations. But now, with the introduction of ORM and Entity Framework Core, or in earlier in .NET Framework terms, just Entity Framework, has significantly abstracted out the complex operations or the heavy code that we used to write to talk to a physical database from our application. So it simply lies between the data access layer and the physical database, right? So that's a brief introduction to entity framework. So I'm going to use code first approach today to build the application database, and I will show that to you in a .NET Core Web API project, right? So as you all know, in code first approach we use the migration files, right? Okay, and then we'll also be looking at how we can seed data to the tables of the database. Once the database is created, we have all our tables with it, and how we can seed the data into the table of our database, right? Okay, so what is database migration and seeding data, right? So as we are using entity framework core uh, code first approach, we will first see how we can create the migration files using the package manager console, and then we are going to look at how we can dynamically uh, build the database via applying the migration file upon application startup. Now this is very important. Upon application startup, or in other words, upon uh, application startup of the .NET Core Web API. We'll see that practically, right? And then how we can seed the data uh, within the application startup itself. So that is also done. The data seeding part is also done at the application startup, right? So these two are important. Okay, so I have already created a .NET Core solution. So let me first explain you the projects that I have created. Okay, so assume this is a Angular based project, right? So this MyStore, the middle project, right? It is the UI project of the application, which we do not have to focus for this demo, right? The main two projects that we'll be focusing today is the MyStore API and the database class library. Okay. Now, how I got the ability to create this MyStore API? So it is basically, if I show you, right click in the solution, add new project, right? And then there's an option called ASP.NET Core Web API. Okay, so you can easily find this template for you if you type ASP.NET Core Web API. So you can uh, quickly find out the template, or simply type Web API, even that will help, right? You can find the template that you require. And I actually developed this Web API using .NET Core 5, right? You can select the option uh, in the project creation wizard. So I'll be focusing on .NET Core 5. Okay, so I haven't actually added any of the controllers here, right? As you can see, it is the boilerplate default controller that is being added to the uh, project whenever a new web API project is created. Okay, right. So do not focus on this controller at all, right? I will show you the important things that I have done. First thing is, right, I added entity framework core design NuGet package, right? Since we are working with entity framework core, I added it to the web API project known as Microsoft Entity Framework Core Design. So how are we going to add a NuGet package? Simply right click, manage NuGet packages, and there you will find the installed NuGet packages. And if you want to install this package from the scratch, you have to browse it here with this name, so that you will be able to install the NuGet package. So since I am using .NET Core 5, I use the latest version under version 5, which is 5.0.17. Okay. Uh, then the next thing is, now I said that we are going to build our database dynamically. So we have to keep a connection string to our database, right? So where are we going to keep our connection string? I have added it into the app settings.development.json file. So if I show you the way I added the connection string, so this is the connection string section, and this is the uh, key for the connection string, and this is the value. So this is my local server, and this is the name that I gave to my database, which is my store, and I'm using integrated security. Now you may wonder whether I have this my store database already. If I go to SQL Server Management Studio, you will not find that database under the databases section, my store. So we are going to create this database or build this database dynamically, right? So let's see how we are going to achieve it. Okay, moving on, right? Next step is, now in a .NET Core web application, you will have this startup class, right? So let's see the startup class first. Okay, so in the startup class, right, under configure services method, you will mostly find the services of the application in which we can create the instances out of those services via the .NET Core dependency injection service. Okay, now we already see one of those services already provided by the uh, startup class itself, right, which is the configuration service. Now as you can see in this startup class constructor, an instance of this I configuration implementation is being injected via the .NET Core dependency injection service to this property itself. Okay, and we can simply consume this configuration instance uh, within the configuration service method. Now, okay, I showed you the connection string that I have defined in the app setting file. Okay, now how are we going to access this that connection string? That is with the use of configuration instance, right? Now, as I said, via the dependency injection service, an instance of the I configuration implementation has been injected to this configuration property, so that we are going to, or we are able to access the connection string defined in the app setting file. Okay, so this is the way we are going to access our connection string. Okay, now when we are working with entity framework or entity framework core, it is always a common fact that we come across a context class or database context class, right? So our context class is MyStore context, and for that context, I am going to pass the connection string as in this manner. Okay, so where are we going to find this database context class? Okay, let me come to the database layer now. So this is the database layer. Again, this is a simple class library, .NET Core based class library. If I show you, as you can see, the target framework is .NET 5, which is .NET Core 5. Okay. Now let us go to the MyStore context class. Now in this MyStore context class, it is inheriting from the DB context superclass, and as you can see, the connection string is being passed via this constructor, which will be accepting an instance of DB context options. So that is how we are going to set up the required connection string of our application. And the second thing is, now this is the database context, right, which is similar or rather representing the database itself. And to map it with a physical table of of the database, we are going to define a DB set. Okay, so I have a very simple database table or a DB set or an entity known as product type. So this is the table that we are going to uh, physically create upon migrating the database via entity framework code first. So this is the entity product type. So where is this entity? This is the product type entity. Okay, so it just have two fields, that is id field, which is the primary key. How do we know that it is a primary key? We decorate it with the key data annotation. Okay, so that entity framework knows that it is a primary key. Next option is the field. Okay, so what is the product type name, which is simply a string. Okay, right. Okay, so I hope you are clear so far, right? We'll talk about this seed class and the seed data JSON file bit later. Okay, then let me get back into the uh, uh, program.cs file. Okay, and explain a bit further. Okay, let me open startup class also, right? Okay, now there's a uh, lifetime for the instances created via the database, or rather dependency injection service of .NET Core. Uh, Now there are three types of lifetimes for those instances, that is scope level, transient, and singleton. So singleton, you know that the instances created out of the .NET Core services via dependency injection will be there throughout the application lifecycle until the application shuts down. And for all the user requests, a singleton instance, only one instance will be available for all the user requests. But when it comes to scope level, right, an instance will be available per request or per user request. So if you can see this services.addDB context, right? Now this is basically a scoped lifetime based service. In other words, we'll be creating an instance of this MyStore context class uh, per request, per user request. Okay. Then at the program.cs, right? By default, you will not see this code at all. By default, you will not see this code at all. When you initially create this web API project from the scratch, you will not see this code at all, right? Let me explain you what I did. So basically, right, you will have this create host builder, that's all fine, but temporary comment out this run method and simply take the host variable, assign the return value of this build method into a variable called host. So you all know that this is the entry point of the .NET Core web application, right? This is where the application starts and builds up the web host, right? So temporary comment out the run method and take the return value of the build method into a variable called host, right? And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to get all the scope level services into this variable. I am going to get all the scope level services into this variable, right? And then what I am going to do is I am going to get the uh, instance of the MyStore context class using this service. I'm going to get an instance of my store context class using this scoped service, right? Services dot get required service my store context. I'm going to get an instance of my store context injected into this variable within this request. Within this request. Okay. Okay. Right. And then I'm going to call context.database.migrate. This is where the database is going to get created in this server. In this server with the name my store. Okay. So what actually happens here is if there are any pending migrations, you all know with code first approach we create migration files. So if there are any pending migration files, then this migrate method will apply those pending migration files and then will physically create the database if in case the database is already not available in our server. So in this scenario, our database is not physically available in our server. So upon application startup, it is expected that the database will get physically created as well as any pending migrations that have not already been applied will be applied. Okay. And then we are going to move into this seeding. So once the database is migrated and the tables are created, now we have the physical table with us. And we may want to seed certain master data or any other data that you want at the application startup. Okay. So that is the purpose of using this seed data method. Okay. Now let me show you the approach I took to uh, keep the data that I want to see. Okay, so let me first close out all these files. So in the database project, I have added a .json file. You can simply add a .json file using add new item. Okay, right. Now I am going to add a JSON file called product.json. I want to add 4 products here. Okay, right. We have only one field name. And then in the my store context seed class, right? Okay, you can see the entire code here. It is namespace database my store context seed class, and it is a static method of no return type seed data, and it is accepting my store context instance, right? And then first of all I check whether there are already data available in this product type uh, entity. If not, I will be reading this JSON file from this location using read all text of file class, and then using the JSON serializer I will be deserializing that JSON data into the product type list of list entity, product type list entity variable. Then I will be looping in that list. Okay, and will be adding the data to this product types db set, which will physically add all the product types defined in that JSON file upon calling this save changes method to the product types table of the database. Right. Now let us see how we can create the migration file. Okay, so let me go to the program.cs and let us see how we can create the migration file and how the data gets seeded. So as the first step, make sure that you set your API as the startup project, right? And then go to the package manager console and make sure your database project is the default project here. Okay, and then type the command add migration initial mig 1. Okay, now the migration file will get created. There you go, the migration is created, and now we are not going to update the database. Okay, we have just created the migration file, and then, okay, simply run the API project with a breakpoint, and you will see that the database will get physically created and the data will also get seeded successfully. Okay. So I have enabled Open API or the Swagger for this API, and you will see now the database is created and the data is being seeded. Okay, so that's all for this tutorial, and if you found this tutorial useful, please like, subscribe, and thanks for watching. Have a good day. Happy coding.